Ladies and gentlemen, in the past 15 lectures, I have analyzed one sphere of human activity after another to demonstrate that man must hold reason as his only guide to action in every aspect of his life. Contrary to the claims of the mystic and neo-mystic philosophers that man cannot live by reason, it is only by reason that man can live if he is to live as man. Whatever concessions such philosophers may make on other issues of human existence, there is no issue on which all the forces of the anti-mind contingents have been focused with such violent intensity, no issue they have so fiercely held close to the power of reason as the issue of sex. In no other issue have they succeeded so thoroughly. It is almost universally accepted that sex and reason are two separate or incompatible realms, that man's sexual life bears no relation to his intellect, that his sexual activity is independent of his thinking and impervious to logic, that his mind is impotent in the sphere of his sexual desires. It is not necessary to argue that sex is crucially important to human beings. We all know it, both by introspection and by our observation of others. We know that no other subject is of so intense a concern to people. We know that they think about sex, they dream about sex, they write novels about sex, they respond eagerly to any advertisements that offer them books, plays, movies, or scandal exposés about sex. They have nervous breakdowns over sex, they wreck their lives over sex, sometimes they even commit murders over sex. Everybody knows it, but nobody has explained why. What is the role of sex in man's life? The answer given by ancient sages, by modern philosophers, or by any man on the street is the same, whether stated in poetic metaphors, in medical language, or in crude vulgarities. They all declare, in effect, that the issue of sex is a self-evident, irreducible primary, requiring no explanation. Or they believe they have explained it by declaring that sex is an instinct, or that such is human nature. Such, of course, is human nature, but the question is, what is it in human nature that causes man's intense concern with sex? That is the question I shall discuss tonight. In spite of our modern culture's alleged enlightenment and scientific sophistication, the modern man's view of sex, like his code of morality, is in essence the same primordial view that infiltrated Western civilization from the mystic cults of the Orient. Metaphysically, that view regards man's nature as consisting of two opposite antagonistic elements, of soul and body, with the soul representing some higher, nobler dimension, and the body representing man's lower animal nature, which belongs to this earth. Man's values, according to this dichotomy, pertain to his soul and are not merely unrelated to, but opposed to, the actions and the needs of his body. Man's body and any pleasure he may seek on earth are base and evil by nature. Therefore, man's virtue consists of renouncing any form of material concern or sensual enjoyment, such as wealth, luxury, production, trade, sex. Sex has always been the focal point of every mystic's attack on man and on existence. Since sex is the most intense form of pleasure that man can experience, it was damned as the most sinful. It was damned as brutal, impure, unclean, evil by its very nature. Chastity, virginity, abstinence were held as virtues, the triumph of the soul over the body. Plato was the transmission belt who carried this view from the Oriental mysticism of the Orphics into Western civilization, and immortalized it in the concept that bears his name, Platonic love. According to Plato, real love is a pure, selfless emotion of the spirit, untainted by any trace of selfish, physical, sexual desire. And sexual desire is an animal instinct of man's body, unrelated to the values of his spirit. Plato's dichotomy was accepted by St. Paul, by Augustine, and by all the philosophers of Christianity. In Christian culture, it became the concept of two different kinds of love called sacred and profane, with sacredness pertaining to the spirit and profanity to the body. With the evolution of Christianity across the centuries, this view of sex was somewhat modified. While the early Christian philosophers damned sex as such and regarded all sexual pleasure as sinful and evil, Some of the later ones adopted a kind of metaphysical compromise. They held that sex is not sinful if sanctioned by marriage and if its primary purpose is procreation. Married people were told, in effect, that the sin of experiencing physical pleasure would be forgiven to them if and only if their primary motive was procreation, and pleasure was only an incidental, unsought, unavoidable byproduct. This was the philosophers' reluctant concession to men's lower nature. Since very few men are able to be continent, they said, and since procreation is necessary for the continued existence of the human race, and the continued existence of the human race is necessary in order to supply God with a plentiful quantity of worshippers, sexual pleasure had to be tolerated in marriage as a necessary evil. Marriage was described as a medicine for immorality. Some Christian philosophers claimed that if Adam and Eve had not fallen from grace and had remained in the Garden of Eden, they would have engaged in sexual intercourse, but it would have been an activity absolutely devoid of any sensual enjoyment, an activity undertaken solely for the purpose of cold, calculated reproduction. Not being damned, they would have had that virtuous advantage. One of the consequences of man's damnation is that he has lost the possibility of a sexual act that would achieve procreation without bringing him any pleasure. Note this particular point. It is pleasure that made sex sinful. It is pleasure that the religionists damned as evil. Now, what was the opposition offered to that view of sex? In the history of the post-Renaissance philosophy, the only opposition to that view of the spiritualists who claim that sex is evil is the view of the materialists who claim that sex is meaningless. The materialists, the modern neo-mystics, who assert that man is a mindless automaton made of meat with conditioned reflexes, the alleged champions of sex who proclaim their desire to set men free of taboos and inhibitions, defend sex in effect in the following manner. It's not true that sex is evil because it's a brute animal function. Since man is nothing but a brute animal, it's not wrong for him to engage in a brute animal function. Why shouldn't he? All his functions are brute animal functions. The only wrong is to pretend that they're anything else. Ladies and gentlemen, is this an opposition to the mystics' doctrines, or merely a deeper and uglier acceptance of the metaphysics held by the mystics, of their metaphysical view of man, the other and brassier side of the same coin? If the mystics of spirit declare that man is a swine who might have a chance to acquire some value after death, the protest of the mystics of muscle consists of declaring, sure, I'm a swine, but I belong in the muck and I don't propose to bother about any values. There are many men who think that they are rebelling against a mystical religious upbringing by embarking upon a course of mindless sexual promiscuity. They think that this demonstrates their freedom from mysticism. In fact, they have conceded the mystic's basic premise, that sex is an activity devoid of any meaning, of any spiritual or psychological significance, that is, of any values. Such are the two alternatives that men have been offered, a choice between the spiritualists and the materialists, between those who believe in values without pleasure and those who believe in pleasure without values. The spiritualists preach that man must pursue moral values, but must not expect any pleasure from them. The materialists preach that man may pursue pleasure, but must not pretend that it involves any moral values. Both accept the fundamental premise that pleasure and values have no relation to each other. In one version or another, the Orphic, Platonic, medieval view of sex still dominates our culture. Let me quote some excerpts from medieval literature written in the late part of the 19th century by doctors who should have known better on the role of sex in human life.